So how does that then lead us to One Day Remains? Because that's the next album on your list.
Yeah. So that would have been, so I got the call from Mark Tremonti in, I think right around Thanksgiving, right around this time in 2003.
And you're a
And
November birthday also, right?
yeah.
Yeah.
Are you a November
Yeah,
birthday?
mine was the 7th, about 2 weeks ago.
Right on. Well, mine's exactly 20 days later. Well, happy birthday.
Nice, thank you. And happy almost birthday to you.
Thank you. Thank you. Um, yeah, I mean, he called, which really blew my mind. Just because at that point, I thought I'd been out of the kind of the orbit, the rock and roll orbit long enough to where I
Yeah.
thought that was pretty much it. And I was working on a solo record. Actually, I was working on something totally different. It wasn't even really a rock thing. It was just very acoustic. It was kind of what I ended up doing,
With
you know,
Year of the
years.
Tiger.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
was more along those lines. So I was surprised, and I wasn't sure until he sent some demos whether it would even be the right fit for what I
Right.
could bring to the party, And then I
Because you know
heard
who he is, and you might get a vibe on the phone and everything, but you don't know what the new band is going to sound like.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So sent the demo. I put the vocals on top, and he sent it back, and then within I don't know less than I don't know 5 weeks or something, I'm suddenly in Orlando, and we're making a record. We're starting the whole process, and it was interesting because I didn't even know if I was in the band for the first 4 months. I was just, I call my wife and well, I'm here and we're working on stuff, but no one's told me anything.
Yeah.
It wasn't until there was this initiation. Mark thought it would be really funny to see me squirm. It was the world's highest free fall. It was like 300 feet, and you basically drop, but you've got this cables, kind of keeping you from death. And that was his way of initiating me.
No,
And
thank you.
I hate heights.
Yeah, me too. Man, you get me like 2 stories up, and I'm good. That's enough. It's far enough.
Right.
Um, yeah, I love those stories too. By the way, where I mean, for some reason, I'm thinking about Gary Sharon, where he's just writing songs with Eddie Van Halen, and they're recording stuff, and then he's out here in California, and then he hears like, oh, they're going to the MTV Awards with David Lee Roth, but don't worry, you're in the band, we think. And then he was in the band, and then they made an album. And I kind of like, there's something almost childlike, a kind of mischief even in that, when there isn't a conversation about what exactly we're doing. It's like a relationship, right? Like
Right.
hanging out with somebody, and it's like,
That's right.
are we dating? Are we a
Is this a
couple? Or
thing? What's going on here? Yeah,
yeah,
exactly.
it seems like that's got to be more fun than the sort of mechanical way that it goes down sometimes.
Yeah, it was definitely not. It was not mechanical. It was definitely very. It was like it would just kind of evolved, and then it became a thing. And and I think what's interesting about that is if you would have told me 16, nearly 17 years later that we'd still be doing it,
Right.
I would have been shocked. And I'll tell you why. Because I at that point was such a realist to the point where I was a pessimist, and I understood shelf lives of bands, and especially bands who've had that kind of success in a prior band. And
Yeah.
even though people would say that they won't get back together and this, that, and the other, in the back of my mind was like, well, we'll see, and I'll just enjoy this process, and we'll make some music, and we'll tour and see what
It's a
happens.
great attitude to have about it, though, honestly, because it's so rare that anyone gets the first go around, let alone the second bite at the apple. And it is, like you said, regardless of how anyone feels, and it's not to take anything away from the truth of those feelings in that moment. But we've all seen this movie before where, eventually the tide changes a little bit, and yeah, and there are sort of, and yet I would argue, even for Tremonti and even for him having different bands and for you having different bands, I think Alter Bridge is the thing that you're both the most associated with at this point. You know what I mean? Like when we think about like who is Myles Kennedy, who is Mark Tremonti, it's like, oh, they're the guys from Alter Bridge. And then there's the other stuff that you guys do. That makes sense.
Yeah.
And that's quite a victory considering, you know, where that started as more of a super group or somebody's new project or the band after the band, or you know, and yeah, and as you said, oftentimes those have a shelf life where it's kind of a novelty, that first album, and people check it out and then it tapers off.
Yeah, it's absolutely right. I'm pleasantly surprised, let's put it that way, that you know, we're still doing. And I think ultimately it's because the fan base that we kind of had to win over show by show. There was a lot of touring and a lot of just building up the old fashioned, because we never really had a massive hit. You know, we'd never been like, well, what Creed is they had huge hits, and you know, they had a label that put everything into that band and made, you know, in conjunction with great songs, and it made it happen. And with AB, it's been we were always having to kind of prove ourselves, you know, first because of where it came from. So there was that initial like, well, they just shutting the door on the band. I mean, the story that always sticks with me is the first record came out, and we were in the UK doing press, and somebody was telling us about how the first record was getting played in the office, and someone said, "Oh, what is this? I like this." And then they replied, "It's so and so, formally, blah blah blah." And well, never mind. It was suddenly just written off, and I was like, "Wow, that's very interesting." Human, you know, it's a subjective medium, so you can.
Yeah,
you know.
And the idea that if that answer been anything else, you know, then they might have been like, "Oh, this is
Right.
great," you know. Let me get a copy of this.
Right.
Yeah, and what that says. That's so
Funny.
interesting. Yeah, you know, and of course that first record, you know, it had a steady climb to gold status. But yeah, when you're coming out of a band with one of the rare rock bands in history to have like a diamond album, I think, somewhere in there, you know,
Right.
It reminds me of like when the first Smashing Pumpkins album that came out after Melancholy only goes gold. You know, it's like normally a gold record's like, hooray, but in that case, it's like, yeah, they're coming off the one that did 8 million or whatever. So it's not until you get several records deep and you can prove this kind of staying power as you have, where you have a robust discography, that you can then really evaluate, I think, these records for their merits on just the creative side entirely, because you're not looking at that context of where it fits into the arc of the momentum of the expectations at the time. Or I always tell friends of mine who are in bands when they're stressing out about deadlines and release dates and this tour, that tour, I always go, you know, Depeche Mode Violator, it's my favorite album of all time. I have so many great memories associated with it. You know, it's the kind of songs that can instantly take me back to different times and places and people and all that sort of stuff. All the things I can tell you about that record, I can't tell you which quarter it was released in, or what tour, you know, what tour they were main support on. So the single had to coincide with the book. And it's like, you know, that stuff's important and it's part of the puzzle, but the records, man, that's what lasts. Like that's right. The staying power, you know? So for us to be sitting here in 2020 talking about that first AB record, you know, to think about those kind of conversations that were happening back then, as meaningful as they seemed to people having them at the time, it's like, you know, it's a footnote now,
right?
Which is just super cool. And that record, you know, in terms of the songwriting, because you're all four credited, what was that process like, and how did it differ from the way that you were accustomed to writing songs prior to AB?
It was definitely a different process on so many levels, because with everything else that I've been involved with, for the most part, I was the primary writer.
Right.
And so now I'm in a situation with, you know, Mark Tremonti, who's a fantastic writer, and it was the idea of learning to you know, basically join forces and collaborate. Now that first record, so much, I would say well over half the tracks were already ready to go, which is part of how we were able to get it out so quickly. Songs like "Broken Wings" and "Down to My Last," and so he'd already had those songs in the can, as they say, and I just had to basically sing. And but then there were the "Open Your Eyes" and "Metalingus" and the things that still hadn't taken shape yet. And but with that said, Mark was the guitar player, and so that was the strangest thing for me initially, was not playing guitar on the record and not playing much live, and I felt completely naked because I've always considered myself a guitar player first,
Right.
Songwriter, singer second. I love the guitar, so that took some time to get used to. And interestingly enough, on the next records, once they discovered that I was a player, then it was like, oh well, let's bring this into the mix as well. So I was
an adjustment on both sides.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, for me, obviously, we all love DLR and we all celebrate early Van Halen. And it hit at just the right time when I was the right age too. I love the Sammy Hagar era, and one of the things I loved about it was him being the Red Rocker and showing up with his guitar, and just seeing the interplay with him and Eddie, and the way that Eddie seemed rejuvenated and to be having fun in a different sort of way. There's that. It's another tool in the toolbox, man. Like, why not use it if it's there?
Right. Sammy was my first rock and roll concert.
No way.
The VOA tour. Yeah, January 1985. It was great. And then
is VOA the record where he's parachuting onto the lawn?
I think so. It was "I Can't Drive 55."
Yeah.
All that.
Yeah, the big one.
Yeah, that was a big hit. And but yeah, I think that it certainly, which I guess would bring us to Blackbird.
Yeah.
That was, so it was different. Now I'm playing guitar, and Mark and I are basically, I'm living with Mark for, I want to say I lived there for the most part for a better part of a year, crafting this record. And though all of us are listed as songwriters, the genesis of the songs generally come from Mark and I, and then we bring them in, and Brian and Scott do an amazing job, with their parts and with it's important. This is the important thing. They're part of the filter process. So it's like, is this riff cool? Is this chorus cool? Yay or nay? And that helps. That really, that's such an important part of the process. Because
otherwise, you might get so in your head about something.
Absolutely.
Or you might, and I'm sure there's times where you're sick to death of something you've been honing away at and ready to toss it out, and then they come in and they're like, "That's really cool."
Yeah.
No, we're not throwing that away.
Exactly.
So that's awesome. And this was your first time, what became a long relationship with Elvis, right?
Interestingly enough, so that musical relationship started on the second Mayfield 4 record. So he was this young, up and coming engineer who had he was going through a hot streak. He just engineered a record, a little record called "Make Yourself" called Incubus, and a fair amount of other bigger records from that late '90s thing. And he was just a kid. But I remember thinking, man, this guy's really talented. He was Peter Collins' engineer, and Peter brought him in. And so when we were talking about producers for Blackbird, his name came up because the guys also liked Chevelle, and he'd done some of the Chevelle records. And I was like, man, Elvis, I couldn't stop gushing about what he would bring to the party. So yeah, that's where that all started.
Gosh, that's crazy. The first time I heard his name and became, I wouldn't say we know each other super well, became acquainted with him. He was doing a band called Brothers Keeper that was a hardcore band from Erie, Pennsylvania in the 90s. And yeah, it was one of those things where then when I started hearing his name in the early 2000s, especially showing up on all these huge records, it was like, well, I was like a kid that was doing hardcore bands, and just seeing his name just this morning and, reading the Rolling Stone interview with Wolfgang Van Halen, and talking about working with Elvis, he's just one of those guys now, like, a Rick Rubin or Garth Richardson, or take your pick of any of those A-list.
And that's who we got to start with, was with Garth. Up, and he came up under Garth's wings.
So with Blackbird and getting kind of more situated, so to speak, and really settling in, when there's a label change like that, and we don't have to belabor nobody cares about the politics part of the interview, but in terms of how that affects the creative process, right? Like whatever the attitudes were, the pressures might have been coming from one label and going into another. Is that something that affects the songwriting, or is it something that you're able to completely, what's your process there to balance out what's happened with this kind of storm that's happening around you, positively or negatively, and how that affects what you're writing?
I think that all of that definitely had an effect, because we were coming out of Wind Up and trying to figure out where we were going to go, and that also made it so that we had so much time to make this record. I mean, I think in a lot of ways the song Blackbird would never have existed if it hadn't taken so long to get out of that initial deal and then get on with Universal, I believe. And so in a lot of ways it worked out wonderfully, and it just afforded us the luxury of refining what we were, and ultimately defining what we were, because I think on that first record it was such a kind of a shotgun wedding. It happened so quickly. We didn't really have time to mold that sonically. So yeah, I think in a lot of ways it was a good thing. And as far as expectations go, sure, there were tons. Universal had high hopes, and they, I think, did the best they could, all things considered. And we had some songs that did pretty well at radio and helped really get things rolling. But it was never like it wasn't like it was in 1999 or whenever it was, where it's you're on MTV and you're Diamond Records. It was successful by rock and your rock band standard, but as far as coming from a mega act like they were, right, it was definitely different. But it was a good process. But we definitely it was and I think it was the only record we did where we had an actual A&R man, an A&R guy. We've never really had A&R guys, which is I think been kind of. There's so much freedom. You just kind of do what you want to do. But the thing with Blackbird is most of the songs were already written. They were all written. So it was kind of like,
and that's the thing, is A&R guys can be intrusive, but there's also something to be said on the positive side, or I suppose this could even just be like your product manager or something. But having someone, when you're at a larger label that's a huge organization, having someone that theoretically advocates for you, like personally, that has a personal and professional investment in your success and is in there, rattling the saber, hopefully, to get all the other departments going for you. When you don't have one of those, then it's kind of, you're adrift a little bit.
Yeah, that is definitely true. You want somebody championing your band. If you think you're just going to get on a label and everybody at the label's just that's just not how it works. And when you first start out, you naively think these things. You're like, oh, we're going to get on this label and we're all going to be friends. You think this, and it just doesn't. Unfortunately, it doesn't work. It doesn't work that way, because first of all, half the people that were there on your first album will be gone by the next record. Well, you've got a new president now, and we learned that with Mayfield 4. I mean, that was part of the reason that we didn't, fortunately, in a lot of ways, didn't have success out of the gate, because I just wasn't ready at that point. But the president of the label, 2 weeks before we were supposed to go in and record that record, got let go. So it was like everything shifted. So yeah.
There's so many stories like that, like, Anthrax doing this huge deal with Elektra, and then a new president comes in and like, what's this band? Or, Danzig doing his album on Hollywood Records, and someone at Disney, as the story goes, is flipping through Spin magazine and sees a cartoon of Danzig shaking hands with Mickey Mouse, and there's, flames and devils and pentagrams, and apparently this Disney executive went, what's this joke about? Oh, that's an artist that's on Hollywood Records. What? not anymore. And it was like,
Really?
weeks after the record came out. All
Wow.
these stories, it's like behind the scenes where it's like just the whims of, whichever way the wind is blowing
Right.
can have such an effect. And yeah, and that thing when you don't have someone championing you, like you said, it's that thing where you're everyone's responsibility, so you're no one's responsibility, right? Like
Right.
it's like when everyone's in charge, no one's in charge. Like
Right.
that whole thing.